Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And understandably, we didn't have a show last night because of the events in the UK. So we are carrying on today. Just to let you know that Will Iredale and Phil Weir, we will schedule another show, another date for them to come on and talk about the kamikaze hunters in the 45. But we felt it was appropriate to not have a show last night. But we are back tonight. So today we are continuing talking about the naval and the aviation in the Pacific, and I can't believe in 557 shows now we've not ever dedicated a show to Admiral Nimitz. He's obviously come up in numerous conversations, but we've never actually talked about him as a leader. Well, we are resolving that today with my guest Trent Hone, who is a highly regarded, award-winning naval historian, and he has written and published a new book about Nimitz, looking at his leadership and mastering of the commands style he brought to the Pacific and the things he did. So we're going to bring in my guest now, Trent, to talk about Admiral Nimitz. So good afternoon, Trent. How are you today?
Quite well, thank you. And thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming. So Nimitz, everybody thinks they know a little bit about Nimitz. There's been movie portrayals, Henry Fonda, Woody Harrelson, and others. And there's numerous books about him. People have talked about his leadership for years and years. What did you think, before we bring up the presentation, what were you looking to kind of analyze fresh? What was the aspect you thought you could bring a different angle to?
Yes, I was looking to build off of the prior work, Learning War, which is a book I published with the Naval Institute in 2018, which looked at the Navy as a complex adaptive system to try to better understand how it learned and innovated, particularly in the years before World War II, and then how that learning system followed through and assisted victory in World War II. So with Nimitz, what I wanted to look at was, well, how does an individual help influence a system like that? How does Nimitz specifically influence the behavior of the Navy in the Pacific, its learning, its ability to fight the war, to organize effectively, to fight against Imperial Japan, and ultimately, with the assistance of numerous allies, triumph in that conflict. And so one of the things that I was really interested in is what is Nimitz's approach to organization? How does he lead? How does he frame orders and issue those to subordinates? And what elements of that leadership style are effective? And in which ones can we look at and say, maybe we should criticize this and perhaps there is a better way? There was another theme that I thought was very important that sort of emerged over the progress of writing the book and researching it. It's a lot of the histories we have of the Pacific look at individual battles or campaigns, and they tend to chunk it up. Even the Morrison's history of U.S. naval operations in World War II, when it looks at the Pacific, there's different volumes about Guadalcanal or breaking the Bismarck's barrier and so on, the fight for the Philippines. And so it's very easy to think of the war in the Pacific in these blocks, in these chunks, and it's more of a flowing narrative. And I wanted to try to recreate that and recreate what that flow looked like from Nimitz's headquarters.
Well, that's a nice response to start us off. And I think I agree with you, is also there. I think I was talking to John McManus a few weeks ago. There's quite a lot of downtime in the Pacific between these campaigns that I think we overlook, where ideas are being discussed and new approaches to tactics are being formulated and thrown around. And we just kind of, as you say, as historians, we kind of leap from these notable actions and battles to another one and don't necessarily think about the ongoing process. And another thing I think is also, when I talked about General Bradley last week with Steve Ossat, is that we don't always consider the staff these people assemble and who they have with them. We think of them in isolation, as if they're some kind of supreme dictator almost, this all-powerful emperor dictating everything, when of course all these successful leaders have successful members of staff and advisors with them who are shaping that decision making. So I think that's another interesting aspect of who did Nimitz rely on as well, who were his main people. We understand that's very important. But you've come armed with a PowerPoint that we'll bring up on screen, and we'll let you control that, folks. Trent is happy to have questions and comments as we go along, and we're going to kind of do this somewhere between a presentation and a chat, basically. But we're going to hand over to Trent to kind of lead us through these slides. Then we're going to look at some of the challenges he faced and the situations and he had to overcome, and what he did to master command. So over to you, Trent.
Yes, thank you. So just to set some context, one of the things that is important to understand is, Nimitz comes out of, and I'll get to staff. Staff is some of the early things that I cover here in this presentation, but it comes from a context. And what I talked about in learning war is sort of a learning culture that developed in the Navy. And I like to use this term organism. I borrow this from retired Rear Admiral Bradley Fisk, who was very influential in the U.S. Navy, the early 20th century, responsible for helping to promote the invention of the office of the introduction of the office of the Chief of Naval Operations, what we call OPNAV today. And he wrote a book called The Navy is a Fighting Machine. And if you look at it, you can tell that Fisk is sort of stretching the boundaries of a mechanical analogy. Because he uses that, he's familiar with it, right? He understands modern engineering principles, but he calls it, ultimately, he gets to the point that the Navy needs to be this vast and efficient organism, and the commander, the leader is the brain, sort of the head of it. And I thought that was quite effective analogy for trying to help understand how the Navy was exploring very important questions in the early 20th century, like how do you form a battle fleet? Right? We've got introduction of all these new technologies. Destroyers that are very high speed and equipped with torpedoes that can sink, battleships. Submarines are introduced. Airplanes come into the Navy, and the Navy, before the United States enters World War I, begins to explore how best to coordinate a large modern fleet in action. There are some large exercises that look at this question, but it's really in the interwar period that it takes off. There are the fleet problems. These are almost annually a large contested exercise, open-ended, tests the ability of officers and admirals to formulate tactics, doctrine, to write operational orders. And what happens, there's a balance between exploring new tactics and new doctrines and exploiting the most effective ones. So I've got a picture of one of the large American aircraft carriers here. And this is the time when the United States begins to formulate aircrafts as an effective element of a modern fleet, right? We're going to integrate that with the fleet. We're going to work out the tactics of a modern fleet, but still fairly battle line centric. And in Learning War, so the first half of it, I talk about that. I talk about how this process occurs and how the Navy develops this learning system that allows it to introduce new and innovative concepts as far as tactical doctrines, as far as how to fight a battle fleet, and how to introduce airplanes and submarines into modern fleet tactics. Nimitz comes out of this. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, if you look at Nimitz critically, is how embedded he is in some of the key aspects of the Navy at this time. And one of the things that I like to use to sort of describe foundational concepts of the Navy's doctrine are heuristics. And heuristics are decision-making shortcuts. I'm using Daniel Kahneman's frame here. He wrote a book, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And he uses heuristics in this way. And I believe the Navy had three of them in this time. One was act aggressively, right? So try to seize the initiative from the enemy and control the pace of battle. And you see a lot of language about the importance of this, about the importance of, the best way to do that, to seize the initiative, is the second one, which is attack effectively first. I borrow that term from retired Captain Wayne Hughes. He has passed away now, but he wrote a brilliant book in the mid-1980s called Fleet Tactics, which has been reissued in several new revisions. And that's where he introduces that term. He says it's a foundational principle of naval tactics. And the third one that the Navy embraced here was decentralization, like allow flexibility in tactics and doctrine so that it's developed at low levels, like in individual destroyer squadrons or cruiser divisions. They're formulating their own doctrine based on the dispositions of those officers, the capabilities of their ships, and how they think they can best work together to fight effectively. So Nimitz is embedded in this context. And you can see he wrote a thesis, a tactical thesis, during his time at the Naval War College in 1923. And he had principles of warfare that he articulated as part of this thesis. And these are some of them. I think they're a really useful window to think about how he fought or approached the Pacific in World War II. You know, employ all the forces with the utmost energy, concentrate superior forces at the decisive point, avoid loss of time. So time and tempo are very important, especially when you're following up an advantage, which was another principle that he stressed. I'll stop there for a moment and see if, Paul, if you've got something that you want to follow up on.
My first comment was going to be, thank you for that. My first comment was going to be, I think when us history enthusiasts look at the interwar period, I think a lot of our focus is on ship design and which types of vessels are being manufactured and ordered and things. It's often about the gear, the gear. And I think with the Navy, we don't talk enough about the sort of doctrinal approach to this. In that, I always find it fascinating as I'm a self-confessed ground war infantry small unit type guy, and the British Army in Normandy, for example, could change how a platoon attacks a fixed position in about 5 minutes. They can just say, we're going to do this now. With ship production, you've put maybe orders in for vessels 15 years earlier that are finally coming off the production line. You can't go back and start something differently that you've started 15 years ago. So I always feel with the Navy, you've kind of got to have this sort of clairvoyant aspect of predicting what war will be like in 10 years' time, which I think is a very unique aspect to the Navy. So I'm glad we're talking about the basic principles as opposed to getting bogged down too early in which type of ships were ordered and which ones should have been, doubled the order and which ones should never have been built, that kind of thing.
And you make an excellent point, because in this time, so early 20s, the Navy is dealing with the consequences of the Washington Naval Treaty, which is restricting what can and cannot be built. No more battleships, at least for a long time. But you can build up to 10,000 ton heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns. And the Navy at this time emphasizes, okay, they are going to have lots of guns, 9 or 10, not a whole lot of armor, and they're going to be fast and long ranged and have scout planes so that they can perform a scouting role, potentially a commerce rating role. And that's what they focus on. Yeah. So these assumptions get, manifested. They become reality in terms of ship design. But you have to be thinking about, or at least to understand and evaluate the ship designs. My experience is you have to have some sense of the context, the doctrine that they are arising from. And you can see some of these differences in doctrinal assumptions between the United States and Japan. I know I'm diverting from Nimitz for a minute, but like if you look at, the Japanese destroyer designs, which are very heavily emphasis on surface action, like lots of guns, lots of torpedoes, big torpedoes. And the Fletcher class, which is sort of the U.S. standard entering World War II, is a much more cross-functional ship. Very good for ASW, fairly good for destroyer attack, and even has an anti-aircraft capability. So it's a ship that is designed to help the fleet make it across the Pacific. It's designed to fit in the context of a campaign. Right. And that's something that Nimitz and his contemporaries and subordinates thought a great deal about.
Well, brilliant. I'll hand it back to you. We've got no questions as yet, although someone said, I hope you'll talk about the relationships with Macarthur and some of the other big players. So although that's a potential massive rabbit hole.
Earlier, you were saying something about how it can be, sometimes we can perceive these commanders as emperors, acting on their own. And I think that made me chuckle a little bit because it made me think of Macarthur immediately.
Yeah, I thought I had Macarthur in my mind when I said it as well. I thought because some of them definitely are in that category. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Nimitz has a much more collaborative and dynamic relationship with his staff, and that's one of the first things that I think it's important to think about in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Yeah. So Nimitz had spent a good deal of time as the assistant head, and then immediately before the United States enters World War II, is the head of what was then called the Bureau of Navigation. It had since become known as the Bureau of Personnel. And so Nimitz understood the Navy's officer corps very well, and was very good at putting people in the right billets, finding the right billets for them, and then making sure they ended up in the right one. And also having the kinds of frank conversations that you need to have, if someone doesn't get the assignment that they think they deserve, that they think they're ready for or capable for. And I'm sure that we have listeners who have had to do that in their own, work context. If you're a supervisor and there's someone who thinks they're great stuff, but they're not quite up to snuff yet, you've got to have the right kind of conversation with them that makes them feel like they're still valuable, still contributing, still moving along the path, but not quite where they want to be yet. And how do you keep them? How do you keep them focused without inhibiting their initiative and morale. And Nimitz faces a huge problem of this nature immediately after Pearl Harbor. It's easy now because, with everything that has come along in our beliefs about and the historiography of the Day of Infamy, because it brings the United States into the war. There's this tremendous resolve amongst the American people. We'll fight, we'll triumph. And with the eventual victory, it's easy to look back at this as a moment of it's unifying the country. It's pulling everyone together, and now we're in the war. But thinking about the context, right? The U.S. Navy has this focus on aggressive action. We will take the initiative from the enemy. And here the Japanese have turned the tables. They've done that to the U.S. Navy, and they have destroyed the heart of the Pacific Fleet, the battle line. Here we see Battleship Nevada, which was the only one to get underway. All the rest are still at their berths. Many of them are sunk, if not total losses. And so Nimitz comes to this. He comes to Pearl Harbor, lands, and there's still all kinds of debris and bodies floating in the water. And the command there is in a bit of a state of shock. And this is pretty clear from testimony who were there and from some of Nimitz's recollections from the 1960s. And so he's got to figure out how did he sort of bring the fleet back together. There is evidence, I think, from the attempt to relieve Wake Island, which is something that Kimmel, before he's relieved, the former Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Husband Kimmel, he wants to try to relieve Wake Island, prevent the Japanese from taking it. The interim successor, Vice Admiral William Pye, decides that this is not a good idea. We're not in a good position. We don't know exactly what the Japanese have prepared there at Wake Island, so we will not try to relieve it. He abandons the expedition. Nimitz was, traveling while all these decisions were being made, and he asked about it when he arrived in Pearl Harbor. What news? They turned back. We abandoned that. Nimitz sits quietly for a minute and thinks about that. But he's got to take all that in, right? And he does something that is atypical, unusual for the time. He decides he's going to retain the whole staff because it was normal, right? New commander comes in, new commander brings his own staff, the people that he's familiar with, brings them into the staff. Nimitz decided not to do that. I'll retain everyone, all of you. I will express my personal confidence in you, the nation's confidence in you, and we'll figure out how to fight back together. And very quickly, he begins to adapt his approach to the personalities that he finds there. And a very important personality is this officer, a captain at the time, Charles McMorris. Sock is what they called him, which was short for Socrates, because I guess the way that he spoke, the way that he expressed himself, they felt he was wise, at least at the Naval Academy when he acquired this nickname. But McMorris is extremely aggressive. He was Kimmel's war plans officer. So he is looking for ways to find a battle with the Japanese. And so Nimitz is sort of balancing that aggression. He's got his own aggressive disposition. So he gravitates towards McMorris and this war plans group. But at the same time, he balances them. He retains Pye on as an advisor. And this is Pye's operations officer, Milo Dremel. He was the commander of the battle fleet's destroyers. Pye had been commander of the battle fleet. Dremel is a lot more conservative, less aggressive, more conscious of risk. And so Nimitz begins to bifurcate the staff in what I think is a really interesting way, driven by these personalities. He starts working with McMorris and the war plan section to try to develop plans that are going to allow the Pacific Fleet's forces to strike back against the Japanese. He doesn't exclude Dremel and Pye from those planning sessions, but he has Dremel, for example, focus more on operations. Dremel heads the operations section, but that group becomes more focused on convoy routing, training sorties, the kinds of things that are predictable, where Dremel's sense of management and his less aggressive disposition may actually be an advantage. Nimitz starts working with the staff in different ways, and he could do this because at this time the Navy doesn't have a rigid or formulaic staff structure. It's up to the commander to figure out how to put his team together and how to use them. And so Nimitz very quickly susses out the strengths and weaknesses of different staff members and puts them in areas where their strengths can be capitalized on and where their weaknesses can be mitigated. And I thought that was very interesting.
And does he look at these people himself, or does he have staff say, tell me what you've got on, and then kind of get data that way. And does he do it kind of with the person's knowledge, like in a formal interview, or does he do it in a sort of a more discreet manner?
That is a great question. I wish I had more knowledge of the specific details of how this goes on, but it's Nimitz's own work. He's not relying on some other team to figure this out. He has familiarity with these officers because of his time on, as head of the Bureau of Navigation. So he's familiar with their records. He probably has a pretty good sense of their capabilities. He might have known some of them personally to a certain degree, but he susses this out, and he susses it out pretty quickly. But I'm sure a lot of it is personal conversations. Like, pull him aside, talk to him. Nimitz was very good at finding. This may sound funny because I'm going to say finding ways to relax. But I think when you're in a kind of role like this, and all the complex burdens that it has, your brain has to have some downtime, some time to process. Right? The problems don't go away. You're just not thinking about them with your conscious mind so much anymore. And there are likely times where he found an opportunity to have a cocktail with these other officers and talk about different things, and use that as insight into their personalities and their dispositions.
Which suggests he's a listener as well, and we could list all sorts of commanders who are perhaps not very good at in listening to other people's views. Just go in with their set of views, and this is what we're doing, and I don't care what you think. But he seems to be already more of a working with the people he's got and allowing them to be part of his new ideas, as well as rather than just imposing on them immediately what he's already thought out. If you're happy to do a couple of questions now, because we said we'd kind of do it in a kind of random way.
There's
We've
one
got some the ones that are coming in already about him, his role, his former submarine career. So Jim is asking, seeing Nimitz was a former submarine commander, did he look into or try to speed up investigation into poor performance of torpedoes in the war? It's a very niche question, but it's there, so I'll hand it over to you.
Well, it is niche, but it's also important. Nimitz very quickly, there are some organizational changes that he decides to do with the fleet, and one of the first is to take the submarines out from underneath the subordinate command that they're in, and have the submarine type command report to him directly, so that he can, because he's got familiarity with the potential of submarines. There was a lot of study in the 20s and 30s about the potential of submarines in the Pacific. It's illegal during that time to use submarines as unrestricted commerce raiders because of the experience in World War I. Nobody wanted to see what the Germans had done in that war. They wanted to see that again, so they made it illegal. But it's interesting to see the U.S. Navy records at the time, because from my read, it's very much Japan is an island nation, so they could be very vulnerable to commerce destruction. But doing that with submarines would be illegal because it's against the law. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Right? So there's a consciousness of their potential, and very quickly. There's a great book, Execute Against Japan, that has been written about the U.S. decision to very quickly engage in unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. So Nimitz aligns with that, moves submarines under his purview, and he develops awareness of the problems with the torpedoes. But there's so much else that is going on. A lot of the important work to discern the problems with them is done by others. Particularly in the Southwest Pacific, out of Australia. That's where they first start discerning some of the critical problems, like the depth of the torpedoes. But it's not until later, it's not until well into 1943 that there's a realization that, the magnetic exploder, this doesn't work. It runs too deep. And even the impact exploder is problematic. And the guide pins are not strong enough to ensure a detonation on impact. Nimitz does get involved during those days. Because then a lot of the troubleshooting is going on in Pearl Harbor, and he's close to it, and he gives his submarine force authorization to deactivate the magnetic exploders, and then is around when there's a discovery that the guide pins aren't strong enough.
Okay, well, cool, and thank you for that one. And this is a question from Scott about his career as a submarine officer, but I'm going to word it slightly differently, because I think a lot of these incredible military leaders, maybe their former role, we maybe place too much importance on that sometimes. I mean, people talk about Guderian, for example, as being a tank officer, but I think it's always the fact he's a signals officer is more important to his to what he did in Blitzkrieg and what have you. And so sometimes when people say, "Oh, well, he was a submariner, that must have influenced that," is that maybe sometimes a red herring? Is in this case of Nimitz, is him being a submariner hugely influential, or is it more his just overriding kind of skills as a leader that is more important?
I think it's more overriding. I think right. His career as a submariner is important. He develops a very detailed understanding of marine diesels. He was one of the Navy's foremost experts in them. In his biography, there's a story about how he was offered a great sum of money to leave the Navy and to work in the diesel industry, and he opted not to. So it's important, but I don't think it's everything. And it's also valuable because it shows how officers in this time were able to sort of move through different phases of their career. What is important, I think, is he had acquired a reputation. Some of the later slides get into this, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But early in 1942, there was doubt amongst the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and the new Commander-in-Chief, now abbreviated COMECH, Admiral Ernest King, among others, that Nimitz had what it took to be an effective wartime commander. President Roosevelt asked Knox to put together a list of the Navy's foremost senior officers. Who are the top 40? Essentially, is what the president wants to know. This is in February 1942, when the Japanese are still advancing across territories in the Pacific, and there's been a string of defeats, and Nimitz doesn't make this list of top 40. He is not considered to be among the best. And so one of the things that Nimitz has to do early in the war is not only to rebuild the morale of the Pacific Fleet, he also has to convince his superiors that he has what it takes. And how he does that, I think, is quite interesting. I can get into that, but
yeah, let's get in with that. Yeah, and again, it comes back. We started off about this idea. We all have an opinion about Nimitz, but it's often with the lens of knowing that he took us through to victory. You made that point earlier. So then we assume that path to becoming so successful and revered in the country was inevitable. When in fact, as you're saying, back in the early days, it wasn't quite so obvious.
Yeah, and so let me get to that by sort of following through some of the slides, but also answering another question that I saw fly by, which is about these early raids in early 1942. Nimitz wants to strike back against the Japanese. He wants to win a victory. He feels like that is something that will address some of the morale problems that the fleet has. And so he's working with McMorris in the war plan section to come up with plans. They have an concept for a raid into the Marshall Islands where the Japanese have bases. And Wilson Brown is he's a vice admiral at the time. He's the senior carrier task force commander. And I cannot, I'm certain, but I don't have Nimitz saying it was Brown that I talked to first. But he does say in an interview that I've seen, or at least seen the text of. So Nimitz's first choice for this raid says, no, I'm not going to do it. It's too dangerous. Fairly sure that was Brown, because Brown came to Pearl Harbor. Nimitz had an opportunity to ask him, and Brown is not the one who is sent on this mission. Halsey is sent on the mission. Halsey comes to Pearl Harbor a few days later, and the way that Nimitz describes it in the 1960s is, I asked him, and Halsey said, I will go anywhere. And so they spend some time putting together a plan. They need to escort a convoy to the south, to Samoa. And so Halsey bides some time. And then once Frank Fletcher's task force, which is going to pair with Halsey's to make this raid into the Marshalls and Gilbert Islands, once they can combine, they head north and make this attack. And it's interesting how Nimitz approaches this, because the first operational orders are kind of like, well, this is what we think you should strike. And they're a little conservative. They've been influenced by Pi. And, but Nimitz leaves in the order, but you got to remain flexible here. Don't commit to these targets because circumstances may change, and circumstances are changing. The Japanese advance southward. They take Rabaul. There's a message from the Australian Naval Board that says, hey, the situation is dire. We need some help, is essentially what it says. Nimitz gets that. Nimitz gets a message from King, who has also seen the message from the Australians. And that message says, you've got to do something, essentially. And so Nimitz sends a message to Halsey and Fletcher and says, look, you can be aggressive. We need it because of what's going on in the South. But also submarine reconnaissance has revealed that there aren't powerful Japanese forces in the Marshalls. So be aggressive. And Halsey is aggressive. They strike Kwajalein, which is in the heart of the Marshalls. And they run roughshod over Japanese defenses on that island and several other nearby islands for a number of hours. They killed the Japanese admiral, who is responsible for the defenses in hindering their ability to counter the strike. Now, the question was, was this something substantial, or is this a pinprick? And some histories, I think the Morrison's history talks about it being like flea bites on a dog. So, just something that you would slough off. The Japanese would slough this off. And initially, the real value is it gives the fleet a victory, right? Halsey's in the newspapers. It's something for the people back home to cheer. But intelligence later on, a couple days later, may even be a week later, I forget the exact duration, reveals, because there's a whole code-breaking network that's going on amongst the Allies, particularly within the U.S. Navy, to try to understand what are the Japanese saying. And that code breaking reveals that Halsey's attack prompted the Japanese Navy to hold back their 5th Carrier Division, Shokaku and Zuikaku. It was going to head south and augment the offensive operations going on there, but it stopped and stayed north for a while to try to deal in case there was going to be another attack. And when Nimitz saw that was going on, and when he could communicate to King, hey, they are reacting to our moves, this increases King's confidence, and it gives Nimitz insight into, well, if I can keep doing these kinds of raids, which they do a whole series of these, then we can force the Japanese to react, and eventually the U.S. carriers become a lodestone that the Japanese high command, particularly Admiral Yamamoto Irisoku, is focused on, and it is part of what draws the Japanese Navy to Midway for their effort to smash what remains of the Pacific Fleet.
Brilliant stuff. Well, I'll let you get a bit further ahead with the presentation. We've got some other questions about coming about Guadalcanal and things later on, but I think we'll get a bit more, let's get further into it before we do a little bout of questions. So brilliant stuff. I'm thoroughly enjoying this.
Yeah. So I'll pass through some of these next slides very quickly. There's the raids on the Marshalls and Gilbert Islands. This is Ernest King and Frank Knox that Nimitz has to begin to win their confidence. And one of the ways that he begins to win their confidence is through these raids. This is one of the most important ones, the raid on Japanese invasion forces on the northern coast of New Guinea in March 1942. This is an attack that Wilson Brown actually leads. So he heads to the South Pacific and redeems himself from his failure to earlier attack into the heart of the Japanese defenses in the Marshall Islands. And there is also, of course, the very famous Doolittle raid that occurs in April. And while this is going on, the code breaking continues to work, and they begin to gain insight. The Station Hypo, particularly, which is in Hawaii, begins to gain some insight into Japanese intentions. And there is a fairly detailed order of battle that is decoded for the Japanese attempt to seize Port Moresby on the southern portion of New Guinea. And so Nimitz works with his war plan section to come up with an order, basically, essentially a plan for a battle, how to ambush the Japanese forces that are going to try to take Port Moresby. And he takes that formulation with him to a previously scheduled conference at the end of April. It's in San Francisco with King. Now, King and Nimitz had a series of conferences throughout the war, but this is the first one. And in some ways, it's the most important because King still has some uncertainty. Is Nimitz the right officer for this? Do we have the right person in the Pacific? And I think you mentioned a lot has been written about Nimitz, and that's absolutely true. And a lot of it focuses on his interpersonal skills, which are things that he wanted us to talk about. They are skills that he had that, he wanted people to be aware of that. And what is less well known is how aggressive he wanted to be, particularly at this time, right? He's facing pressure. Is he the right person? We need a victory. The Japanese have had this string of successes. Well, I have a plan here, and I've got it with me, and here's how we can stop them, and here's how we can win a victory. And he goes over it with King. Say yes right away. But by the time after the conference is over, Nimitz flies back to Pearl Harbor. By the time he gets to Pearl Harbor, he has King's approval. And that is what triggers the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, Nimitz's plan doesn't work out. Nimitz expected that he would be able to bring all 4 of his carriers together because Halsey is still with Enterprise and Hornet. Hornet has just conducted the Doolittle raid, and they don't make it to the Coral Sea in time. So instead, there's Yorktown and Lexington under the command of Admiral Fletcher. And Fletcher secures a strategic victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby is thwarted. The small carrier Soho is sunk, but Lexington is also lost. And so this is not a good exchange ratio for the United States. Nimitz talks about that in a message to King. We cannot afford to exchange losses at this ratio. And so now Nimitz is looking for an opportunity. How do I get better odds? How do we secure a more substantial victory? And this is where code breaking again becomes extremely important because as Coral Sea is developing as a battle, the intelligence is starting to emerge that is going to signal what the Japanese are intending in the Central Pacific, the run up to the Battle of Midway. And I was very impressed going through a lot of the research for this with how important Nimitz is here. I think of it more as his battle than anyone else's now, because he positions the forces, he coordinates everything, he arranges this trap for the Japanese. And one of the people that he works with to do it is the new head of his war plan section, Lynn McCormick. McCormick had been McMorris's assistant, but McMorris went to sea, a necessary step in order to be promoted to rear admiral. So McMorris goes to sea, commanding a cruiser. McCormick steps up, and McCormick helps formulate the plans that are the foundation of the Battle of Midway. And there's a great in a series of conversations, actually, and emails that I was having with John Parshall. Parshall has recently published a book, or not a book, sorry, it's an article in the Naval War College Review. I think it's called "What Was Nimitz Thinking?"
I read it today.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And what John Parshall helped me realize is there's optionality here with Nimitz's plan, because Point Luck, where we normally think about where the carriers were positioned, is a way for Nimitz to decide late whether he wants to commit them to battle, because he's not certain. How many Japanese carriers are coming? We think it's 4. It could be 5. Is this actually the plan that they intend, or is this some kind of spoofing or deception? There was some concern in Washington that might be the case, and so Nimitz positions the carriers at Point Luck. Fletcher has to command them. Nimitz originally wanted Halsey to command them. Halsey is too ill, can't do it. So Fletcher's in charge. And I think it's the second. Yeah. So the carriers sit there. Oh, there was a question as to whether or not Yorktown would be able to fight. Yorktown is able to be repaired and goes to battle. So Nimitz has things starting to fall into his favor. And as the intelligence reveals more clearly that the Japanese plan is going to unfold the way that his intelligence unit expected and the way that he expected, and as he becomes more convinced, because there's been an intercepted message that Zuikiku's carrier planes are in the home islands, not in the Central Pacific, which suggests the carrier is not coming to Midway. Nimitz, on the 2nd of June, 2 days before the battle, tells Fletcher to move west so that the U.S. carriers will be in position to strike immediately after or at least as soon as they steam close enough, which is a matter of hours rather than a day potentially. And that's what happens. The Japanese carriers come close, they strike Midway, they get focused on Midway because Midway sends, dozens of planes. Nimitz has packed it with something over 100 planes, and they distract the Japanese carrier fleet. Admiral Nagumo is focused on striking Midway again, rearms his planes that were being held back to strike any potential U.S. carriers or ships that might be in the area. And that's when the carrier planes from Fletcher's carriers hit the Japanese. And most of the battle is decided, within a matter of minutes with the dive bombers that hit the Japanese carriers. Only Hiru survives, and she is found and sunk later in the day. So Nimitz creates this opportunity and Midway, and it works out well. for him, and that changes the nature of the war in the Pacific. I wouldn't go so far as to call it the turning point, but it does create an opportunity for the Allied forces to go on the offensive, and
it raises his stock clearly. I mean, the uncertainty about whether or not he's suitable post Midway has kind of completely gone away. He's proven that he can do what he can do, and therefore it's full steam ahead with that. And I agree with you and John Parshall that his mastermind, the masterminding of the Midway battle is way more than just the kind of lucky break that some of the movies and things kind of put it all down to, these kind of circumstantial things, and it's a very well planned victory. And I think it's come up in the sidebar. You've probably seen it yourself. People talking about intelligence and code breaking and things like that. And when you said earlier about the need to be aggressive, I'm thinking whether the word maybe proactive isn't maybe more suitable than aggressive, because being able to master the improving on a weekly basis naval intelligence, the code breaking that's improving all the time. That's another type of skill, isn't it? It's not all about maneuvering a fleet in the Pacific. It's keeping yourself up to date with the changes in technology that are aiding the Allies to master the war. So I think proactive to me sounds in some ways a more suitable word than aggressive. It's a bit of both. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I struggle with the term proactive, but what you use to describe it, that is keeping up to date with emerging information, whether that's intelligence or whether that's tactics, that is one of the themes that came out that I stress in the book, came out through the research, and I stress it in the book. Nimitz is very good at making sense of what's going on. I use
keeping on top of things.
Yes, exactly. And then adjusting to maintain advantage in light of that new information. So he's restructuring the fleet periodically. Like initially, when the war opens, there is a battle fleet and there is a scouting fleet, and these are part of the U.S. fleet, the Pacific Fleet. And those are done away with. They become an administrative layer that is unnecessary. And then he's very focused on, well, we need to get good information from action reports. So everyone has to write action reports. They have to do it in a fairly standardized way. And then we need to cull information from these so that we learn what tactics work, what tactics don't. And those are going to be the responsibility of type commands. And the type commands are going to be ashore. They used to be sort of dual-hatted. You'd have a seagoing command, and you'd also be a type command. And you could either do, sort of keep up to date with your orders, or you could keep up to date with the administration of the type. Couldn't do both in wartime. So type commands are established ashore. They review these action reports. They decide what are the best tactics for a particular type, types being like destroyers, cruisers, carriers, etc. And the ability of Nimitz's command to process this information and to make sense of it, especially intelligence, is so important. And I like the term aggressive because it fits with the context of the time, but also because of how it's used. It's a means to an end. And that mean is get inside the ability of the opponent to make their own decisions. So make your decisions faster or with better information so that you can gain an advantage through that. Proactive is not an incorrect word. It's just
you have a better one, which is absolutely fine. And going back to what we said about this more constant narrative of Nimitz's leadership, as opposed to leaping from battle to battle. So it would be very easy just move straight on from Midway and move a few months ahead to another major engagement. But we're already getting questions. Gary, for example, is asking about. Well, I'll read it. I believe after Midway, Nimitz preferred to do further intensive training over immediately taking the offensive. What are your thoughts about that, given the U.S. Navy's problems early in the Guadalcanal campaign? So that's an interesting thing, because if we do then move into the land campaigns on the islands at the beginning there, so that post-war period, most Midway books kind of bring things to an end at the Battle of Midway, and then that's the book chapter or the book closed. So how important is those next few months, as you say, your slide there, June, July, August?
Well, I think it's very important, right? Because Admiral King recognizes that now there's an opportunity with the defeat of the Japanese carrier force at Midway, or at least the bulk of it, and he wants to make sure that the lines of communication between the West Coast of the United States and Australia are preserved. And so a way to help ensure that happens is to take the offensive quickly and early, and to capture Guadalcanal, where the Japanese are building an airfield, and then the anchorage across the sound at Tulagi. So King sort of poses this, right? He issues orders to Nimitz to undertake this action, Operation Watchtower, before he gets full approval from the others, his peers on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So King is also, very aggressive and has a reputation for that. Guadalcanal, the campaign, I think, is extremely important. I said a moment ago, I'm not sure that Midway can really be considered the turning point. I think Guadalcanal, in my mind, is the turning point, because this is where the flaws in the pre-war U.S. Navy, its tactics, its doctrine, its assumptions about how to fight, really get exposed. And so there's a great deal of learning that happens in surface warfare tactics, in amphibious warfare, in logistics. All these things are taxed in ways that the Navy was not anticipating. And it is costly, as the question points out. But here, again, I think it's important to think about it from the Navy's perspective. There's a lot in planning documents from this time. There's a concern that the Japanese will consolidate what they have captured, and they will build defensives that are going to be very difficult to overcome. And I think eventually, as we look later in the war, a lot of that comes true. Here, they haven't had as much time to prepare. And so there was a very clear emphasis on, we can't let the Japanese maintain the initiative. We can't let the Japanese consolidate their gains. We have to do something. And so that's one of the strategic elements that's at play here. The other one is sort of thinking about it from a global war. King has concerns that if the U.S. forces aren't going to get employed the way that he and General Marshall would like in Europe, if they're going to get diverted to North Africa rather than trying to invade the continent of Europe as early as they possibly could, well, then why not use whatever forces we have available in the Pacific to try to create a draw here to let our allies, like the British, for example, know that we're serious, that if they're not going to be serious about Europe, we're going to use our forces in the Pacific. And we're going to sort of bend, we're going to flex this Germany first assumption that we've all agreed to.
Right. And I was just thinking while you were saying that, Guadalcanal, of course, as well, is the first big combined arms test, isn't it? I mean, you said that yourself. I mean, Midway is it's Navy and the Navy aviation, but Guadalcanal is everything. It's ground, it's intelligence, it's logistics, as you say, it's everything. And so, how, as a broad question, how good is Nimitz at embracing all these new things that are happening with this idea of, as the war progresses, and Amtracs and amphibious and rocket firing landing craft, things like that? Is because the Navy of his youth was sort of a little bit more simple in that regard, and now there's all these new assets. So what are his strengths and weaknesses when it comes to all this combined arms aspect?
That it tees up a point that I'd really like to make, so thank you. Nimitz is by this time Nimitz is a theater commander as well as a Pacific Fleet commander. He's become commander-in-chief of the Pacific Ocean areas. It happens in April, if I remember right, and April 42. And Nimitz approaches jointness in a way that is different from some of the other American theaters. They're all going to be joint, right? Combined, really. Each theater commander is a combined command. That is, all the forces, whether they are any U.S. service or from any ally, are unified under that theater commander. So Nimitz has U.S. Army Air Forces, and then there are allied commands. New Zealand, for example, is part of this group, and he pushes jointness down. That is, some Macarthur. Let's contrast with Macarthur, for example. Jointness at Macarthur means Macarthur's general headquarters is joint. That's where jointness lives. And then Macarthur gives his subordinate commands based on what service they're part of. His subordinate naval officer, his subordinate Air Force officer, his subordinate Army officer, gives them orders and tries to tie together their collaboration at a fairly high, fairly centralized level. Nimitz pushes a lot of that downward. So each of these islands that are in his purview in the South Pacific is a joint command, right? There may be Navy airplanes at the base. There may be a Marine Defense Battalion, and maybe there's an Army platoon or something that is there also. There's going to be one commander, one joint commander of that island or that island group who is responsible for all of it. And so Nimitz finds ways. I mean, that's a structural way, but then also through his personality finds ways to collaborate. And one of the weaknesses, I'll skip ahead a few slides, but one of the things that becomes obvious as a weakness in the South Pacific during the Guadalcanal campaign is that there is insufficient collaboration amongst the services. Gormley, Robert Gormley, who's the Vice Admiral Commander in the South Pacific, is having trouble coordinating everything, is rather passive in some respects and apprehensive that the Japanese are going to not only retake Guadalcanal and push the Marines out of their position, but then also advance southward. And so he's sort of hedging his bets and not working as effectively with the Army as he might. And so Nimitz in September comes to the South Pacific, has conferences with Gormley, visits Guadalcanal, something that Gormley has not done, and eventually is convinced after returning to Pearl Harbor, after consulting with his staff, that Gormley needs to be relieved. He's not doing well enough. Halsey has been installed to replace him, and Halsey starts collaborating with the Army. And that is really transformational in a lot of ways, because there's a brigadier general, his name is Raymond Williamson. He takes over the port at Noumea on New Caledonia, and he transforms the operation of the port because he applies the Army's logistical know-how to it and manpower. And so 50,000 tons of supplies are unloaded at Noumea in November of 1942. By January 1943, it's 210,000 tons. And so what begins to happen after November, there are victories in the battles of that month and in some of the earlier battles that prevent the last serious Japanese attempt to take Guadalcanal. But one of the reasons that's the last serious attempt is because they just start getting outpaced in terms of the ability to provide supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the island. They cannot keep up with what Halsey's command can do. And so even though in December they were considering another attempt to retake the island, later that month they give up. And they're like, no, we're going to withdraw what forces we have and we'll concede, and we'll try to draw a solid defense farther up the Solomon chain.
Brilliant stuff. Let's move through a few more slides and we can do a few more questions.
Absolutely. So let me see. What is the next slide? Where are we now? Oh, learning. So one of we've probably touched on most of what I wanted to say here, but because you asked about the proactive nature of Nimitz's command. And the point that I wanted to stress here is so much happens. Like I said, a lot of the pre-war assumptions are invalidated by fighting at Guadalcanal. Tactics, doctrine, logistics, etc. And one of the things that I think is important to think about how Nimitz's staff works and how he makes sense of information is he tries to keep it relatively small. So this is what his staff looked like after Midway. There's not a whole lot of people here, right? This is it. This is the whole thing. And it's after Midway because we see Raymond Spruance just to the left of Nimitz. Nimitz is sort of center, first row seated. Yep. And to his right, our left, is Rear Admiral Spruance, who becomes his chief of staff. So it's not terribly large. So they're very effective at prioritizing what is most important, but also very effective at sharing information amongst this group because there aren't too many people. And you see naval officers of this time, Spruance made this point that, the larger the staff that you have, the more people you have to inform, the more people you have to keep up to date. And therefore, that slows your speed of analysis and decision making. So there's a deliberate consciousness about keeping the staff small so that it can be agile, so that it can make decisions quickly, so that it can make sense of new information relatively quickly. Now, it does grow significantly after this, particularly later in the war. Nimitz creates an advanced headquarters in Guam, and at that time, the staff virtually doubles in size. So it begins to grow quite rapidly as the war goes on. But early in the war, it's kept relatively small so that it can make sense of these things. And you see a lot of new initiatives or learnings coming out based on the fighting in the Solomons. The Combat Information Center, which I'm abbreviating on the slide, CIC. This is instructions to create them are issued from Nimitz's office, Nimitz's command in November 1942, right at about the same time as the main battles that are taking place for Guadalcanal. And so the Combat Information Center is important because in many histories, you'll get what I think is an unfortunately shallow view of radar, the potential for radar, and the U.S. Navy's attitude toward it. And yes, U.S. Navy ships have radar early in 42, but they don't use it very effectively. One of the reasons they don't use it very effectively is because it's difficult to make sense of the information that it provides. A lot of commanding officers try to do that in their heads. And there's so much information coming at them, they can't do it. They can't do it fast enough. They get overwhelmed. And so it took some experience to realize we have to have an information processing mechanism, a team that deals with information from the various radars, because there will be multiple: search, fire control, and so on. And there will be different radio circuits that we have to monitor. There will be sighting reports from lookouts. We have to make sense of all these things and then provide a distilled essence of what the most valuable information is to the ship's command functions and the weapons. Coach the weapons on the targets, tell the commanding officer what's happening. The CIC did that. And Nimitz's instructions, they're only a couple of pages long, explain the need for this. But the only real detail they provide about how to do it is they talk about having a plot. And here we see, a vertical plexiglass plot, because this is an escort carrier and there's a need to keep track of airplanes. But many other ships had just horizontal plots. So what happens is Nimitz is activating this habit of learning that the Navy had developed prior to coming into the war, because he tells them what he wants them to do, tells his ships what he wants them to do, create a CIC. Doesn't really explain how. And they begin to experiment. And then the best techniques are identified by the type commands and then promulgated back out to the fleet. So by mid-1943, you have more standardized practices emerging. By later in that year, it's become fairly sophisticated. And I like to contrast the battles of November 1942, fought off Guadalcanal, with the ones near Bougainville in November 1943, Empress Augusta Bay, and the Battle of Cape St. George. And there, the U.S. Navy has transformed its approach to night combat because it has combat information centers. The Japanese have no equivalent, and so they are out. They begin to get outclassed. Another really important document that's issued is Pacific Fleet Current Orders and Doctrine, or PAC-10, in June 1943. This is based on learnings from 1942, not just off Guadalcanal, but how to handle carrier task forces. And this is really a trigger to allow the fleet to reorganize based not on the battle fleet, but on carrier task forces. And so here, Nimitz and his staff are, again, making sense of the changing nature of war. It also provides a more solid baseline, more solid foundation for surface warfare tactics. But really what it does, it allows the fleet to begin to operate as sort of this network of carrier task forces that can distribute to overwhelm parts of a Japanese defensive island network, like all the different airfields in the Marshalls, for example, or the Gilberts, and then concentrate if the Japanese threaten to seek battle, like they do at the Battle of Philippine Sea. Another critical thing that Nimitz does, this is beginning to prepare for a campaign in the Central Pacific, because through 1943, there's some question about, what shape is the Pacific War going to take? Will we continue advancing northward under, by this time Halsey is in under Macarthur's general direction in the South Pacific. So there's a campaign that is advancing up to Solomons and through New Guinea with the objective of returning to the Philippines. There is also serious consideration of a major operation in Burma, Operation Anakim, which does not come out. And given that it doesn't, now Nimitz needs to prepare for an offensive in the Central Pacific, which is where he and King think the Navy can be best put to use. And as part of that, Nimitz introduces a new staff organization, a fully joint staff organization. Previously, he only had certain sections of his staff that were joint. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about this, you can see the joint staff in the middle, the J4 logistics group, which is sort of right under the text that I've written. That is headed by an Army officer, Edmund Levy, who has come to the Pacific from the Army Services of Supply, not only to help Nimitz, but also to review how its logistics being done in the Pacific. And he has some very strong criticisms because the Navy is much less formalized than the Army, let's say. Part of that is deliberate, is because the Navy is very mobile. So the logistics have to be fluid. But Levy comes in and helps Nimitz's command begin to prepare for a rapid and sustained offensive through the Central Pacific, through the Japanese defensive island networks. And I think this is really interesting how he begins to mix jointness and draw on sort of the best expertise from different services to try to put the most effective staff together.
I mean, that is really fascinating, and I'm now wondering whether these skills he had of recognizing that you need an army guy to explain how army logistics works and setting up these other systems, was that something you think he showed signs of early in his career, or is it something that's happening as the war, did war kind of heightened it and refine it? Are there people around him he's taken some inspiration from? I'm thinking there's some kind of connections with what the British are doing with Ultra over in the UK that are similar to. Is he an ideas magnet? Is it coming from himself? Where do you think they're coming from? This progressive way he thinks.
I think he's got a foundation from early in his career about the importance of collaboration. One of the things that influenced him strongly was the controversy that emerges after the Spanish-American War. After the Battle of Guantanamo Bay, there are different U.S. admirals, Sampson and Schley, and they fight it out in public about who was most responsible, for the victory. And then they have supporters on either side who carry that forward. And Nimitz sees that as embarrassing, problematic. So part of what he's motivated by is a desire to avoid any of that. He's trying to find ways of collaborating together that are going to prevent that from working, and at the same time be smooth, so that the war can be won most efficiently. In one of those conferences with Gormley, it's funny because he curses, gosh darn, but he uses different words, but it's blanked out in the minutes. But what he says is, if we don't use our allies, we're gosh darn fools. It's in the context of how most effectively to triumph at Guadalcanal, and he's trying to encourage Gormley to use the army. Don't just rely on the Marines. So put the army on Guadalcanal. There are troops that are available. Send them, and we have New Zealand allies. We have others here. Use them too, because use everything that we can. It goes back to his principle, concentrating force at the decisive point. Overwhelm the enemy with whatever advantages you can find.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned that, because getting involved with the New Zealanders and the Brits and the Australians things, because one of our buzz phrases on World War II TV is the fact I don't like the nationalistic studying of World War II. Americans read books about the American campaigns by American authors, and British read books about the British campaigns by British authors, and so on and so forth. Because if you're talking about someone bringing in other nations, Admiral King has to be brought into the conversation, because he doesn't really like anybody else, does he? I mean, it's fair to say he wouldn't like me very much because I'm British. So does this create some tension with King? Because it seems to me so far King and Nimitz's relationship has been pretty healthy, but was that going to cause any issues there?
There is it's wonderful that you bring this up. It was fascinating to me to look at some of the records of how is the British Pacific Fleet going to come into the Pacific and actually be used. And this is where friction, at least from my interpretation, definitely exists between Nimitz and King, because Nimitz wants this to happen. Look, this is another carrier group. Is it just like American carrier groups? No, but
it's going to be different. But
but it can serve a role. And so we should figure out how to bring it into the Pacific, and how can complement the other things that are going on. And there's an agreement. The combined chiefs of staff, the political leaders of the U.S. and Great Britain agree. We're going to bring the British Pacific Fleet in. It's going to become part of the operating area. This is late 44. These agreements are being made. It's getting worked out in 1945. And once King first tries to. It feels like he's just trying to make it more difficult. He has a legitimate concern. He knows that the logistical support for the U.S. Pacific Fleet is limited. Adding the British to that is going to cause a problem. And so he insists in the combined chiefs of staff discussions that the British Pacific Fleet must be self-supporting. It has to have its own logistical tail. We, the United States, will not be responsible for it. Okay. The British agree. And then King just kind of like, okay, whatever. It's almost like he feels like that means they're not going to make it. But they are going to make it because they can, you get supplies from Australia. They work with Nimitz to gain agreement to use Manu's harbor and the Admiralties. They can establish their own infrastructure there. So Nimitz works a lot of these details out. There's an awful lot of messages back and forth about how to coordinate this, how to make it happen. And then Nimitz starts working out, okay, how operationally, now that the British Pacific Fleet is here, how are we going to use it operationally? Well, we can begin to use it to support the campaign in Okinawa. It can guard some of these southwesterly islands where the Japanese have air bases. And the British are gung-ho for this. Yes, absolutely. Station us off there. We've got these carriers. They've got armored decks. We can, slough off kamikazes in a way that your carriers can't. So how about that? And there is, in one of the orders in the archives about this, they've got it written, what the British Pacific Fleet is going to do. And then it's crossed out. And there's a handwritten note, we don't have approvals for this stuff yet because King is sort of puts the brake on it. And he uses the excuse that, well, we don't know what's going to happen after Okinawa. And before we have a commitment from the combined chiefs of staff about that priority, I want to hold the British Pacific Fleet in reserve. So you can't have it yet, Nimitz. You can't use it. And that goes on for a couple of weeks until the deadlock is broken and King finally gives his approval. But there are messages. I love it. I think it's from Fraser, if I remember his name right, the British commander. And he's exacerbated. He's like, what do I have to do? Nimitz, what do I have to do to get my fleet into action? Because this is what I want to do. So there's definitely some tension there. And thank you for reminding me of that.
No, it's any chance to mention the fact the King didn't like us Brits. I always bring up. We've got some questions about organization and radar. And Trent Telenko, our resident kind of radar expert, is making a point there that I'd like you to address. He said, I'd argue the lack of staff for Nimitz's Central Pacific left Third Fleet much less skilled with electronic warfare than Halsey's Fifth Fleet with SOPAC experience with Japanese radar. So I have to say I don't understand all of the words in that sentence, but I'm hoping you do, Trent. Well, I understand the words, but not the meaning.
I'm having trouble following that as well because the Third Fleet is Halsey and the Fifth Fleet is Spruance. I think what the point is that there's a lot of valuable experience that he's gained in the South Pacific,
right?
With Japanese ways of fighting, techniques, methods. And then is that all transferred to the Central Pacific, to Spruance's Fifth Fleet? And one of the things that I'm not sure about the validity of some of that because a lot of the ships are the same. Right. This is why I mentioned earlier that Halsey was under MacArthur's generalized direction. I saw someone correcting me quite appropriately, saying Halsey was under Nimitz. Absolutely, Halsey is under Nimitz, but Halsey is following MacArthur's generalized direction in terms of what offensive steps to take and win through much of 1943. But the ships that Halsey's using are the same Pacific Fleet ships that get used in the Central Pacific. Some of the new ones come, so the fleet grows, but there's a good deal of experience that follows through. So I unfortunately don't feel like I understand the question fully, or at least
maybe Trent will refine it. But let's move on with some of the points you want to make, and then we'll do some more questions in a minute.
Sure. So back a slide actually. So the Central Pacific Campaign, there's a recognition that it has to move quickly. I mentioned earlier that there's fear that the Japanese are going to consolidate their gains. Well, now it's some number of months later. And there is apprehension that the war is going to go on too long. And maybe the American people aren't going to have patience for a lengthy campaign in the Pacific after Germany is defeated. I think there's also some concern, misplaced, that perhaps the British are not going to be interested in fighting in the Pacific after Germany is defeated. But these are things that are in people's minds. And so there's pressure on Nimitz to execute, to move quickly. And one of the things that his group does is formulate a campaign plan. Codename is Granite. And it lists future operations as a series of options. And the intent is to give the Joint Chiefs of Staff enough information so that they can begin to either say, yes, proceed with this operation, or don't. So it gives them context in the theater. They need information, planning information from Nimitz and Macarthur and other theaters so that they can decide, where to allocate the resources, particularly of the United States, but also Allied forces. And one of the initial operations in this Central Pacific are Operations Galvanic and Flintlock. Galvanic is the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Flintlock is the Marshalls at the end of January 1944. And Galvanic really tests a whole bunch of concepts, amphibious assault against, a well-defended atoll, these new coordination and operation of carrier groups as specified in Pact 10, and also a new level of mobile logistics support for the fleet, initially performed by Surface Squadron 4. And it works. But part of the reason they're interested in, let's sort of nibble at the Gilberts rather than going directly to the Marshalls, which is really what they consider their primary objective, is to test these theories. It's a little bit less risky. And also there's a lot of concern about shipping. So initially the objectives of Galvanic are Tarawa and Nauru. And Nauru is heavily defended, and Nimitz doesn't have enough amphibious lifting capacity or troops to assault both Tarawa and Nauru at the same time. So they modify the initial instructions and go after Macon instead of Nauru, because Macon is less well defended, and you can assault it with a smaller amphibious force. But it works. And then now the question repeats. We need to take positions in the Marshalls, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, planners in Washington, want to do it in one operation. So King is telling Nimitz it has to be one operation. You take the Marshalls in one bite. That's the term that they used in their conferences. And Nimitz really honestly doesn't know how to do it. So a lot of the planning documents that iterate over this are like, okay, well, we've probably got to take these three objectives, like Kwajalein, Wochi, and some others, but we don't have the forces to do it. So how are we going to do it? There's a carrier raid after the Gilberts into the Marshalls, and photographic reconnaissance from that raid reveals that the atoll at Kwajalein, which has a series of islands, has everything that they're going to need, because it's got two air bases, one in the north at Roy, Namur, one at Kwajalein in the south, and it's got an anchorage, so you can anchor in the atoll. There's also another anchorage that they could seize at Majuro, which is relatively undefended. And so in December 1943, Nimitz conferences with the individuals who are most responsible at this time for helping him plan upcoming operations. McMorris, who's returned to the staff after his time as a cruiser and task force commander, and then Forrest Sherman. And the three of them agree, yeah, Kwajalein will be the target. So later on in that month, Nimitz brings his operational commanders together. So that's Spruance, who's commanding the 5th Fleet, Turner, the 5th Fleet's amphibious force, and then others, and says, we're going to attack Kwajalein. That's what you're going to do. None of them want to do it. They all think it's too risky. But Nimitz insists, and apparently has quite the exchange with Turner, who I'm sure many of your listeners know could be bad-tempered. And Nimitz is basically like, look, you do this, or you can go sit back stateside. Go do something else. I will fire you. But Turner does it. They do it, and it works. It works. It goes off extremely well, in part because the Japanese have been whipsawed. They're waiting for this attack in the Central Pacific. But when it doesn't happen when they expect it, they send their forces south. And so there's really nothing to oppose the Pacific Fleet when it comes into the Marshalls. Their defenses collapse. Spruance is able to take his reserves and attack Eniwetok far earlier than anticipated, Operation Catchpole, and then executes Operation Hailstone, which is a raid on Truk. And the Japanese abandoned Truk. This is a major fleet base in the Central Pacific. And so the fact that the Granite Campaign Plan has been structured as this series of options, different subsidiary operations that could be executed when the time is right, allows Nimitz to, based on this opportunity, accelerate the offensive. And you can see some of the acceleration here in this chart, right? So the Marshall Islands come off a lot later, or almost a month later than anticipated, right? Initially, the target was to have them in January. And they do happen in January, but the last day of January. King was sure of that. He was like, yeah, you can delay it, but it has to be in January. And then a whole series of these operations are either deferred or accelerated based on the collapsing Japanese defenses. So I mentioned Catchpole, which is Eniwetok. It was originally going to be May. It happened in February. Macarthur feels like he has to keep up. So he initiates, defers the Kiving operation, accelerates his assault on the Admiralty Islands, and then his advance to Hollandia, instead of being in June, that happens in April. And MacArthur's advance is facilitated by the fact that Australian forces on the northern coast of New Guinea have captured a Japanese code book. So the Australians are able to break Japanese army codes. So MacArthur knows where the Japanese army's forces are, or at least has a pretty good idea. And that is what is causing him to begin to move rapidly. But for the leap to Hollandia, he has to use the Nimitz's carrier forces. So Nimitz's carrier forces become sort of the engine of this accelerated series of offensive operations. And the next big operation in the Central Pacific is Forager, the capture of the Mariana Islands, which was originally conceived to happen in November, but it happened in June. And then the Plough operation Stalemate instead of December happens in September. So the way Nimitz and his staff conceptualize these offensive operations allows them to sort of pick and choose and reroute, and they do. They take advantage of Japanese weakness and move very, very quickly. I'm
really glad you've put that table up there, because I think, again, for some of the viewers watching this who are not perhaps obsessed with the Pacific theater, they're more ETO. I think often we think of the Pacific as like a piece moving around a Monopoly board, where each next island hopping kind of campaign is an inevitable and planned and move on from the previous square, and you're just moving around this board, going closer and closer to Japan. I think some of this 44 period, where, as you're stressing there, Nimitz is adjusting and recalibrating and advancing things and delaying things and cancelling things based on the situation, isn't necessarily how the general sort of history buff conceives of the Pacific campaign at this point of the war. Have I got a valid point there?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that I pointed out at the beginning, right? We sort of have this, if we think about the operations in isolation, they gather sort of this linear progression.
They seem very consequential, and that one immediately just naturally evolves into the next one. Whereas, as you're explaining, it's much more fluid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there until well into early 44, there's a sense that the United States will have to invade Truk. The large Japanese base, Operation Roadmaker in Gymkhana was supposed to be sort of a preamble to that. But it gets bypassed, and that has serious consequences for logistics, because Truk was going to be the major base west of Hawaii. Yeah. Right. So Nimitz and his staff are conceiving, well, we will take Truk. That will become a major staging area for future operations. That'll be our major base. When the decision is made to bypass Truk, one of the reasons they can make it is because of how logistics have improved. It doesn't have to be as static as it was. It doesn't have to be as reliant on bases. Now it can be more flow-based. They have mobile support. I mentioned Service Squadron 4 earlier. Service Squadron 10 by this time has been created. It absorbed 4. And so now they have a mobile base, and they're getting better at mobile logistics. They've always been, not always, but for many years, they've been able to refuel the fleet on the go. But now they're starting to replenish airplanes for the aircraft carriers on the go, and there's enough mobile support at these anchorages like Majuro, eventually like Ulithi, that they can do fleet support there. So you don't need to capture a major base anymore. Part of why that works is because there are staging areas in the South Pacific, in the Solomons, that can be used for troops, right? Because on a small atoll, you can't get a division ready for the next invasion. You have to have barracks. They have to be able to rest and recuperate and train. So you need an island for that. But the atolls are sufficient to replenish the fleet, at least at this stage of the war, before true mobile replenishment gets introduced at the end of 1944.
Well, I'm glad logistics has come up, because everybody should love logistics. Before we just elaborate a little bit more on logistics, we've got a couple of questions that I think worth mentioning now, because they both similar things. So Josh White is asking, did Nimitz really go ahead with Peleliu because he didn't want to give up landing craft troops to MacArthur's ops? And Jay White, framing it and asking it in a different point of view, didn't Macarthur insist on Peleliu needlessly? So let's address Peleliu from whichever angle you want to come at it from, because we've got different sort of suggestions of what's going on from the viewers there.
Yeah, this is a topic where I'm not sure I have an fully adequate. I'm not fully satisfied with the answer that I have here.
Right.
So this is part of Operation Stalemate. Peleliu is near Palau, and so what happens with Forager, the operations in the Marianas? The Japanese have withdrawn to their next line of defenses, the Marianas and the Palaus, and in the landing of Saipan, one of the Mariana Islands, the Japanese have twice as many defenders there as anticipated, and so the defenses are much stronger, and they come out with their fleet. Battle of Philippine Sea. So Nimitz adjusts very quickly to this new information and adapts Operation Stalemate. It initially was going to target a whole series of islands, but he dials it back so that Stalemate 2, its next iteration, will take Peleliu, Anguar, Ulithi, and Yap. And when Halsey takes over, he assumes command of Third Fleet. He relieves Spruance, so Fifth Fleet becomes Third Fleet. Halsey's now responsible for executing Stalemate. As a preliminary operation, he raids into the Philippines. Japanese resistance there is much lighter than anticipated, at least aerial resistance, airplanes. So Halsey says, we can just ignore Stalemate. Take Ulithi, because it's a great anchorage. Everything else, ignore it. Nimitz isn't ready for that. He drops Yap from the list of targets, but he keeps Peleliu and Anguar. And I don't think it's any problem of sharing forces with Macarthur, because what Nimitz tells Macarthur, well, actually, he's telling the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's sort of pressuring Macarthur indirectly to try to accelerate the advance. He says, look, you can have this amphibious corps that I've got ready. It's 3 Army divisions that was going to assault Yap. You can have that so that we can get to Leyte in the Philippines in October. I think we should do that. And Macarthur, by the way, if you don't agree to that, I'm going to invade Iwo Jima. And so Macarthur's at sea, preparing, part of the invasion assault on Morotai. And so he can't respond. He's observing radio silence. But Sutherland, his chief of staff, is available. And through this 3-way conversation, Sutherland, Nimitz, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Sutherland agrees. It's like, okay, if we can get to Leyte in October instead of later in the year, if we can bypass Mindanao, let's do it. And we'll take Nimitz's amphibious corps to do that, and the associated assault shipping. So Nimitz freely gives that up to accelerate the advance, but he insists on Peleliu and Anguar. And I think looking at records and maps, I think the reason he wants those is because they're going to be airfields on each one. There's going to be a Navy airfield on one of them and an Army Air Corps airfield on the other. And it's going to give coverage over the Philippine Sea. So many of these advances, like Gilbert's, Marshall's, Marianas, they're within range of heavy bombers. And part of the context here is to secure air bases to ensure that bombers can perform reconnaissance over the sea for the fleet, but at the same time, bomb the next series of targets. And so I think that's what's in Nimitz's mind. Like, I need to take these places so that I have airfields for these heavy aircraft, Army B-24s or Navy PB-2Ys. I think they are the Navy equivalent of the B-24. Yeah. And I think that is where a lot of the logic comes in. But, as the viewers are alluding to, Peleliu is a terrible fight.
Absolutely. We've done a few shows on Peleliu. Again, before we go back to logistics, it's come up a couple of times exactly when we talk about Macarthur and Nimitz. Are they equal as commanders? Because I have to say I'm very confused by exactly. I understand what their roles are, but I'm not really certain exactly who who's the top dog. I can't really make sense of it.
Well, they're both theater commanders. So Macarthur was given the Southwest Pacific Theater, which has Australia and then New Guinea and the Philippines. And Nimitz is given the Pacific Ocean areas, which is divided into the South Pacific, Central Pacific, and North Pacific. So Nimitz is working with the Army, or at least through his subordinates, working effectively with the Army, particularly in the South and the North Pacific, but then also in the Central Pacific once this offensive begins. But their peers, but they don't report up the same chain, right? Macarthur is reporting to General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army. Nimitz is reporting to King, who's in the Navy, and this is a good launching off point to talk about some of the friction that they have. Initially, they're able to get along to a degree because they have these different areas, and there is some friction early on. Macarthur is not confident that Guadalcanal will be a victory. He's very apprehensive about the situation in the South and Southwest Pacific in sort of mid to late 1942. Things get better through much of 1944, but then the campaign in the Philippines begins to create more tension again because Macarthur it's difficult to extract. Nimitz finds it difficult to extract some of his forces, particularly some of his old battleships from Macarthur after the invasion of Luzon. Macarthur insists on holding on to them. Nimitz wants them for future amphibious operations, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But MacArthur's logic is, I need these to protect me from the remaining Japanese forces. Nimitz's argument is, well, if I go sink them, they can't hurt you, and so let me go sink them, and I can go sink them if you give them to me, or I can go sink the Japanese if you give me the old battleships. Yeah. But they really get into it later because the Joint Chiefs of Staff realize we can't have this bifurcated command structure as we get closer to Japan. It doesn't make sense. So during the Okinawa campaign, as the U.S. military begins to conceptualize what an invasion of Japan would look like, they change the command structure in the Pacific. And they say, okay, MacArthur, you will now be responsible for all the Army forces throughout the Pacific in Nimitz's command area as well as yours. And Nimitz, you're going to be responsible for all the naval forces in your area as well as MacArthur. And they cannot see eye to eye on how to transfer these forces. Because one of Nimitz's points is, I am not going to take over responsibility for any naval forces that are part of an ongoing operation. So if they're part of your operation, which a lot of naval forces in the Philippines were, because MacArthur's continuing to consolidate his hold there, you keep those until the operation is done, until there's a clear transition point. Because if I take over in the middle, I won't have enough context. I may give them the wrong orders. We don't want that to happen. MacArthur is much more insistent on, you give me all the Army forces now. I want all of them. And Nimitz is trying to say, but a lot of the Army forces I have are defending bases. I need them to continue to defend the bases. So we need to come to terms on an agreement here. And they have trouble seeing eye to eye. They have trouble seeing eye to eye in terms of how to structure the invasion of Japan. Nimitz wants to run it very much like the operations through the Central Pacific, where there is an operation commander, usually a naval officer, who is responsible for the fleet and the amphibious assault. And until that person who's going to command the land forces is well established ashore, that naval commander controls everything. And then once the land force is established ashore, that Army officer or Marine officer takes over command of the land forces. So there's a split, and there's a very clear time to do that separation. Nimitz thinks they have conferences. They get together. They talk about it. And Nimitz leaves those conferences thinking that they have agreed the invasion of Japan will go similarly. So that basically, Nimitz is going to be in charge. And then once MacArthur gets established ashore, MacArthur will be in charge of, the land forces, the land fight. MacArthur wants to run it all. And so he sends a message to Marshall saying, I don't really feel good with how this conference ended up. I don't agree. And Marshall says, well, if you don't agree, maybe we should revisit that decision. And so MacArthur does. And I think that if the invasion of Japan had come off, a lot of this tension would have manifested somehow. I'm not saying the invasion would fail, but it probably would have been made more difficult because of this friction about how to organize the command and how to actually make the command effective and work.
Wow. And if these things, when these tensions start building, there has to be some kind of release of steam eventually. I mean, they can't just go away. We were talking last week in World War II TV about Patton and Bradley's relationship that started, it had some peaks and troughs, but it really got bad in the Battle of the Bulge, and then essentially never really recovered because Patton ends up dying. So in this situation, the Pacific, unless you separate these two individuals for a year on individual, tropical islands, it's gonna rear its ugly head at some point. But in the end, as you said there, the war came to that rather abrupt end before it did get to that point there. But let's let's just run through a little bit about Nimitz's mastery of logistics, and then we'll bring it to an end. And I can tell you that I did a little thing on the side by saying, "Do you want me to invite Trent to come back again?" And it was I unanimously.
Oh, I saw a whole bunch of eyes going by. I don't know what those.
That was me saying, "Shall I invite Trent back again? If so, say aye." So we can come back and delve into one of these aspects at a greater level of detail if you want to in the future. If you're happy to come back, of course. But let's wind up some logistics aspect of his understanding of that for today.
Sure. So I was speaking earlier about the service squadrons and the importance of them. So 4 and 10 are really they're mobile bases, but they're bases. That is, they operate from an anchorage. They have repair ships. They have all the Navy had invested a lot of thought and then into building ships that could allow for mobile, allow the fleet to be mobile, allow it to repair itself effectively and continue to operate. There's great examples from the fighting in the Solomons, because many U.S. Navy ships are torpedoed or sustain significant damage, and they are repaired by repair vessels at either Tulagi or other locations in the South Pacific before getting more extensive repairs elsewhere. And so this is working fairly well. But what Spruance begins to recognize, and this is where I think a lot of the idea comes from, but he's collaborating with the service squadron, an admiral named Calhoun, who's responsible for Nimitz's service force, manages all the service squadrons. They realize if we're going to have sustained operations near Japan, right? So if we're going to capture Iwo Jima, if we're going to capture Okinawa, then we're going to have a fleet presence there for a long period of time, right? The fleet can't just show up and then drop the Marines and leave for a week and replenish and then come back. So we have to be able to replenish not just fuel, not just planes, but also ammunition and food and any other kinds of supplies. And so the concept that is introduced is a mobile replenishment force, the mobile logistics squadron, and this becomes Service Squadron 6. And the concept is formulated in late 1944, and Iwo Jima is really where it starts to get used. Iwo Jima is famous for the land fighting, but one of the reasons why I think it is really important is because this is the first time, aside from the Doolittle raid, where U.S. carriers are operating off of Japan, and they begin attacks in the Tokyo area and other Japanese installations to try to disrupt, not just cover the amphibious operation. So that's the initial emphasis, but later on they're trying to disrupt the ability of Japan to make war, to destroy industry. And it's the Service Squadron 6 that makes this possible. And then it really begins to shine in the Okinawa campaign. So throughout that campaign, there is the Task Force 58, the fast carrier forces of the Pacific Fleet, are operating off of Okinawa. Now, one task group at a time will rotate back to Ulysses, so pilots can rest and recuperate and recover. But the rest, there's always a sustained presence there. And in Okinawa, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a substantial, drawn-out campaign with an awful lot of violence. Because by this time, the Japanese have decided that their way to victory is to try to extract as much blood from the Allies as possible. Wear down the patience of the public to continue to make war, make it too costly. And so being able to keep the fleet there is crucial to success in that campaign, and then to the follow-on raids on Japan.
Well, I'm going to think that's about the time we should bring this to an end now, then have you come back if you want to in the future and do something else. Because my last question is going to be to round things off, is that when you have someone like Nimitz who has this peak in the sense of Midway, that can be both a good thing from the historical point of view, but it also be a bad thing, is it becomes the one thing that people define him by. And as you've explained tonight, and obviously there's a huge amount more detail in your book over a lot more chapters, is that it is only one of many qualities and he brings to the US Navy in World War II. So my question is, is Midway kind of a burden for Nimitz, or is it rightly regarded as his main achievement?
I think it's important, but I wouldn't regard it as the main achievement. I mean, it is if you want to look at a battle where he is most successful, that's probably the best one to choose. Yeah. But I think I've placed a lot of emphasis on the campaign that follows, starting late 1943 and through the end of the war. And I think that is where all, or maybe not all, but at least it is most exemplary of the depth and breadth of his skills. Because it's not just how do we organize forces to succeed in a battle, how do we arrange that, how do we establish that command. It's how to sustain this campaign, how to make the forces that are available most effective. And I see some people have made the point, which is very true, right? By this time, the industrial output of the United States is enormous.
Yeah.
But it becomes an organizational challenge. How do those forces get to the places that they need to be? How can they be supplied? How can they be refueled? And how can we make sure that they are in the most effective place at the most effective time to further the goals that we have in terms of, bringing the war to a successful conclusion? And that's a significant challenge. And that is where Nimitz and his staff, I don't want to give him all the credit because he organizes his staff very effective. That's where Nimitz and his staff, I think, really shine.
And exactly, and this is this thing about it being an ongoing, constant narrative of his career rather than just these isolated peaks that happen that are the ones that we know about. It is an evolving by evolution, not revolution, but at the same time being very imaginative, starting things off himself, having a great staff. It's a progressive thing that we should be remembering him for, not just that one pivotal, but as people have made clear in the sidebar, not necessarily the most pivotal, but a pivotal moment in the Pacific. And that's another discussion of the day is when we talk about pivotal moments, everybody's got a different top 10, haven't they? I think, and the positions in the top 10 are always changing depending on what we've just recently read. But we will bring things to an end. So the book is available now. What are you working on next? I mean, Nimitz is now, but you've done a few titles in the past, quite prolific. But what's the next project for you?
I am working on an article that draws on a lot of the logistics from the Nimitz book. And then enhances that with some more recent research that I've done to sort of argue, a point. The point is similar to something that I've already made. It's really the integration of Army and Navy approaches to logistics that make the Central Pacific logistics that we see later in the war so effective. It's not just an Army show, it's not just a Navy show, it's this integration of the two, and that's something that Nimitz, through his staff, works and succeeds at. So hoping to get that done and published soon, and then back to find the next topic, the next big topic. Maybe that'll be the big topic. I don't know.
Well, brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, I think people have just been astounded by how much you know and how brilliant this has been, and it's been a star performance as far as I'm concerned. So I'm just going to take you off screen for a second, bring you back in a moment. So folks, we have one more show in this week, Saturday, a rare Saturday show for me. John Bruning is coming and talk about Race of Aces. That will conclude this Navy and Aviation in the Pacific week. And then I'm off for a week next week doing some film work, which I can't talk about, but it's all very exciting. And then I'm back again the week after, and we've got some exciting shows lined up about, yes, again, Operation Market Garden. But I wasn't going to do it this year, and then I found some really amazing guests with some really amazing things. And I thought, you know what, Woody, do another Market Garden week. But I promise you, we aren't going to be rehashing the same old, did Urquhart do this, did Gavin do that? We're going to go some different directions, particularly a show I've lined up with a Dutch researcher about the US Army Air Corps bombing of the areas of Holland or Netherlands before Market Garden, which frankly was all new to me. So that'll be fantastic. That's all coming up in 2 weeks' time. So as always, the details you need are in the description below. Links to Trent's website in the description below. You can find links to purchase his book, or you can use your own favorite bookshop to buy his book about Nimitz, and everything else you need is in that description below, including social media links. So thank you very much for your company again, folks. I'm going to bring Trent back in, basically say goodbye, and back to the word mines for you. Get that article out so we can learn more about logistics. So it's been fantastic talking to you. Did you enjoy talking to our erstwhile band of viewers?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And very happy to have the positive feedback from the group and the questions.
Brilliant.
I really appreciate the dynamic nature of this kind of exchange. So thank you very much.
Well, brilliant. We'll bring you back on for a dedicated logistics show then. So thank you very much, everybody. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. So I'm going to see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.